Hello, my beautiful mythical old souls, and a huge warm welcome back. Could your ancestors be closer than you think? And could their stories hold the key to both your struggles and also your healing? In this week's episode, I'm joined once again by the wonderful Caitlín Matthews. Caitlín is an internationally renowned author, a teacher of shamanic training programs, a facilitator of systemic ritual, and the co founder of the Foundation for Inspirational and Oracular Studies. Together, we journey into the systemic context of shamanism, exploring the hidden web of our ancestors, epigenetics, and the stories we each carry. We reveal how our personal narratives are deeply intertwined with ancestral legacies, shaping who we become in powerful and often invisible ways. We talk about how personal experiences can activate ancestral stories within us through family histories, cultural rituals, or even moments of theatre or storytelling, and why recognizing these connections is essential for genuine healing. Throughout our conversation, we explore the metaphor of the spider's web as introduced by Caitlín, inviting you to reconnect with the hidden threads in your own life, recognizing your place within this web of ancestral and collective stories, exploring how you might weave new paths of healing, transformation, and understanding. And before we jump into all of that good stuff, I am delighted to let you know I have finally, after weeks and weeks and weeks of promising, opened the doors to my brand new crucible for women called Beauty Potion. It's the alchemical antidote to the beauty wound. So if you're called to awaken your own mythic beauty, come join me. All of the information and how you can join us is at the link bemythical.com/beauty. And if you're struggling to walk your soul path in this crazy modern world and would benefit from support, guidance, and kinship, come join our Academy of the Soul Unio. You can find out more and join us at bemythical.com/unio or click the link in the description. And now back to this week's episode. Let's dive in. Hello, Caitlín. A huge warm welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Leanne. It's lovely to be back. I'm sure that we're going to have a very interesting time today.
Oh my goodness. It's as you were just saying, each time we've spoken, we've ended up going in kind of all kinds of weird and wonderful places. And my sense is perhaps with this one more than before, but let's see.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of scope for that today.
Yes. So let's begin right there. So we're talking about the systemic context of shamanism. I don't know if that's exactly how you would have named what we're talking about, but I think that's kind of roughly what we're talking.
It's kind of that
Yeah.
we're operating in, isn't it? So,
Mm.
so I suppose that most people are used to coming to see any kind of practitioner, whether it's a doctor or a shaman, as an individual, and the whole of our society is predicated on things being for the individual because we're all individuated now, aren't we? Post Jung, and and often people are bringing things that obviously are stuff that is going on with them. However, the context of what's going on is a much wider one because every time someone
Mm.
walks into any kind of consulting room, they bring in their family, they bring in their workplace, they bring in their belief system, they believe in that, they bring in their ancestry, all those different contexts. So a person is not just a one person by themselves, completely discreetly in a little box. They're actually connected, like a spider's web is connected. I mean, in fact,
Mm.
I suppose that's quite a good analogy that the spider, well, at least spiders in our country, in Britain, um, weave their webs by first of all putting in the long threads that
Mm-hmm.
connect places where the web's going to be strong, and then they do the windy part. Yes, I know that different spiders in different countries have different webs, um, but all our lives are like that. We're all connected to different things, so as you know, a web is completely connected by its long threads. And if you walk through one of those long threads, it all kind of goes, "Ooh." And so do our lives. So
Mm.
if something happens in your family, there's a displacement in your family, somebody dies, or there's a terrible row or something, then obviously it's going to have effect on the whole of your web. And if there's something wrong at your workplace and they're laying people off and there's uncertainty and fear, then that's going to have an effect on it. And then I suppose, going more globally, that if world events are going on, those are also changing and, wobbling your web so that there's fear and uncertainty again. So I think, when a shaman is doing healing work, they're not just seeing an individual, they're actually treating the family, they're treating the ancestors, they're taking into account all those other things.
Mm. Gosh, that metaphor of the web is so powerful, and I was visualizing, as you're saying, someone coming to a doctor and looking like they're one person, but actually, if you have the sight to see it, they're bringing in this whole host of people with them. And I don't want to take this out. I'm sure, knowing us, we will kind of dip into these places, but without wanting to take it out too far, are you at this point mainly focusing on their human family, as a, because obviously context can mean all sorts of things? You mentioned, for example, what could be going on in the political climate that's around them. It could be currently I'm studying with an indigenous Mongolian shaman, and realizing from that point of view how important the spirits of the land are in a way that can really affect us, talking about nature spirits, nagas, and how that can be a really in our Western view, a really misunderstood part of that context. But I think, although I'm not saying you're dismissing all of that, I think you're saying for the moment, let's focus on the family
Land
context.
is absolutely, I mean, obviously, for example, at the moment, we've just had this, mid-North Sea collision with an oil spillage, which is obviously going to have a profound effect upon, the ocean immediately, upon all those living in the ocean and all those living either side of the North Sea, because they'll be dealing with the fallout of all of that. So, and that's that's a man-made disaster in the environment, but it will nevertheless feature very largely in the life of people who are dealing with that,
Mm.
that's involved. So, so I think that whatever a client comes in with, we have to have the context. We can't just deal with them as an individual who has a few symptoms.
Mm.
We also have to take into account that larger picture. And when people present, they will present their symptoms, but they won't necessarily present the context. And so those are the things we always have to ask about, aren't they? They're always,
Mm.
so are you currently in a relationship, or how many children do you have? The usual kinds of questions that we will ask, but also I suppose the main thing, if there's been some unusual change in some, and obviously if they're seeing a shaman anyway, but they're not coming for a cut finger and they're not coming for a bit of a psychological appreciation. They're looking for something much deeper because there's something mysterious going on. And so we always have to ask the questions concerning the epicenter of that occurrence, if it's known. Because very often it isn't known.
Mm.
Very often people will present if the thing is very mysterious and they're beginning to feel got at. So we're at that exact same edge where people begin to go into that, oh, maybe something really weird is happening, in that. And then the next step beyond that is superstition, because
Mm.
it's exactly the same superstition that you would find in the 17th century, which is, my car's not well. Hang on, what's different? Oh, I know, I spoke to my neighbour last week, and suddenly there's a whole kind of new story and witch, and and ends nastily. But people go very quickly to that point.
Mm.
They often come and they will say, I think I'm under a curse, will be quite standard. and this would be very, very rational people who these words are reluctantly being dragged out of them. I think someone's doing some magic on me. And so, of course, when usually to follow that up, you have to ask, well, if you think magic's being done on you, in what way, if you have any sense of of that happening, have you been hanging out with a coven? Have you offended someone deeply? What has been going on? And they usually can't tell you. So then it's the sort of the what's behind that. So we need to look into lots of different areas to be able to establish what that is, because the mysteriousness of it may be that it's something that's happened recently. I mean, I can give an example. I mean, one's culture and background is also very important in this, I have to say. And so I remember seeing a young student who was training to be a doctor, and with him, there really was some magic going on, because he'd come over to this country from overseas, and he was fulfilling a very good and interesting career, and then suddenly he couldn't walk more than a mile anywhere. As soon as he walked a mile of somewhere, he would stop breathing completely. So it was almost like he was on a long rope. And so he would walk.
And it was like precisely a mile.
So my next question was, okay, tell me more about your family. So he did. And he'd been staying in the house he'd come over and was staying in the house of a distant cousin. And so this particular culture, he was from Pakistan, I knew that there might be possible problems, so I was sort of asking, so tell me, how is it living at your cousin's house? And it was like he didn't have a room of his own, was immediately clear. He was allowed to work in a little back room, which was kind of what we would call the scullery, the bit off the kitchen where you wash the clothes and did the dishes. And he slept on the settee, which didn't seem like a really good idea. And I said, have you noticed any strange or different things happening at home? And he said, yes, when I go to put my shoes on them in the morning, there are little pieces of paper with writing on them in my shoes. So I said, okay, I think we know what's going on.
Oh my gosh.
They put an earth gene on him, basically. So, so immediately, this weird symptom of not being able to go anywhere was, at least we'd kind of got, but it was jealousy, just family jealousy, which was in that case, which was precisely what everyone thinks when they're under a curse is really what's going on. But
as you say, that's probably the rarity that someone genuinely is under a curse.
In this country, yes, there is a lot of ill wishing and nastiness, but that usually arises in a professional and family context. And people aren't sticking pins into anything. They just hold malice for someone and, play out in many ways. But generally speaking, when people come with that kind of things are mysterious, I'm sure someone's doing this to me, or I'm sure I'm being cursed. When you explore how do you think you're being cursed, we then begin to hear that other members of the family, either, in the extended family or going back further in time into the generations, have suffered something similar. And so then you really need to be looking at ancestral causation. And the ancestral causation can be all sorts of things. They can be, terrible, unfortunate things that have happened to people who have come into this country, via migration, whether forced or economic migration, and coming here to be in this country to be safe. And now they are physically safe, but the sort of the anxiety and fear that was in the family is still going on. And so the picture begins to build, and so you begin to know which areas you need to go to in order to look at where those long threads of the spider web are broken or have been walked through. So I think
yes,
those are sort of some of the the things that we see in this case. But for someone themselves, they do not see that certain things would be incredibly important to know. So if we get through a whole case history with someone, and I say, is there anything else you think that I should take into account here? And then that's that sort of that hand on the door when the person turns towards the doctor and says, the real question that they've come to. And you oh, well, I was one of twins, and you think, oh, you know.
That's so familiar.
One twin is dead now, so
yes.
Of course there are problems that need sorted out, but those sorts of things. And so you give everyone every possible opportunity, but they didn't think that would be an important piece of information.
There's so much here that's arising. So firstly, I was pondering how in ancient times, when we lived kind of much more in communities with, real connections to each other, to the land, these things would be known, not just known factually, not just known in terms of, what happened to our grandmother, for example, but the meaning of that would also be known. It would be sort of saturated within that way of living. And of course, we've completely come away from that way of living, that understanding of what happened to our family, our ancestors, and as you say, and the meaning of it. And I was thinking, it's interesting how science is beginning to catch up with, for example, the study of epigenetics, where it's like, maybe it does affect us, but it still feels as though there's a lot to still kind of come into focus where we truly understand what that means and also how it affects us and how we can work with it. There's so, because I think sometimes we might, like in the example of the, if we've lost a twin in childhood, for example, we might know factually that that's happened, but with no understanding that it would had any impact. I just was recalling something personally that in the first year or so of my shamanic training, we were doing some ancestral work, and it suddenly dawned on me where my great great grandfather was awarded an MBE. And I always knew, well, I don't think I always knew that, but at some point I'd known that for a long time that happened. And I had this realization in a ceremony of how almost like the weight of that had kind of like impacted the subsequent male descendants with this almost like burden of, I need to live up to that. And then the effect that it had on each generation of man since then. And it's just not been something in my awareness. It just wasn't in my awareness. Suddenly it was just so obvious. And I'd never seen that before. And it now makes so much sense.
Indeed, having a hero in the family feels like it might be a very wonderful thing because it's an honor to your family. But for other family members, it's not often seen as that because it is a burden. And several cases where that's been, that's been going on. And people have felt really, no, I can't live up to it. I can't.
So I won't even try. Some generations are just like, oh, just be a dropout.
And also the way that the love in the family is redistributed. Whereas, of course, my son is, and all the other children stand around going, "Oh, we're not really here, are we?" So it's all very difficult. But you mentioned epigenetics, and I think that this is something that a lot of people are not perhaps very familiar with, and that we understand that our genetics gives us our color of our eyes and hair and all the rest of it. That epigenetics, the part of our, the behavior of our ancestry and how people have done or responded to things is also equally important. And the epigenetic factors, when they replay, are really significant. And I was just thinking about this earlier on and thinking, I've seen lots of very ordinary replays of things when a whole set of circumstances have come round again, which have caused everything to reignite. And it's almost like the dip switches in the ordinary DNA turn off or on.
Mm.
You know, what has happened. And then strange behaviours begin to happen, and oddnesses which are quite alarming sometimes, and memories. And
Mm.
I find it very interesting that not only when those things happen again, like at work, someone says a particular thing after you've had a terrible circumstance, and suddenly you're in the same situation that some ancestor was in, you know, a few generations back. But also, I've had two cases where going to the theatre has been the trigger, where obviously a story is being presented on the stage, either in a dramatised or musical context. And both clients in this instance were sitting in the audience feeling, oh, how wonderful, I'm in the theatre, isn't this great? Oh my, and it's so-and-so playing whoever. And suddenly they felt this kind of sense of dread, or a sense of being almost like shafted by something that's kind of come into them, because the story is actually enacting an epigenetic instance of something. I had one recently. In that case, it was a memory of abuse that had arisen as a result of being in quite a nice, friendly, ordinary kind of show. That there it was dramatically being represented again.
Mm.
A whole wave of stuff came out. And in another instance, someone was at a musical, and I can talk about this instance more particularly because the client has now died. But the she'd gone to the theatre with someone who was not her husband, who kept saying to her, "I will marry you, but I've got to get rid of the wife I have, and I've got to make arrangements for my family, etc." And there she was, and I think it was some kind of it was either a musical or a play edition of Pretty Woman. So it was
Mm.
something where there were some unclear relationship situations, and she was really enjoying it. And then suddenly, her situation, there it was on stage, and then all sorts of things began to come up, and she wanted to commit suicide from that moment on.
Goodness.
And when we unpicked that and looked at it, it was that in the previous, sort of generation, that someone had been in exactly that position of not being able to be properly married, or living in a situation where they were not, the relationship was unclear.
Mm.
And it had
Mm.
led into a whole history of suicide, which was very, very different. And suddenly that was all suddenly on the plate, as they say in France. So it was a very difficult situation. And she went from being a perfectly ordinary and quite cheerful person to someone who wanted to commit suicide, and she had to be institutionalized. And I'd seen her as she just came out from that. So the situation was pretty hopeless. Everyone had really sort of given up on her and said, well, she could go home, and they'd just have to take care. It was the care in the community period, where we can't look after all these people. Yeah.
Oh, bless her.
A
It's
really horrible situation.
mm.
So I think we have those sorts of things are really quite hard, and very mysterious to people.
Mm. There is something about even knowing these things are happening beyond what we typically think as rational, but they are still true. There is something that I think we've really lost the understanding of culturally, that, what we're talking about here is so helpful to recognize. Like, things don't have to be what we understand rationally and logically. They may not, and yet they can have these profound effects on us.
It may not be our stuff, and because we're
Mm.
such individualists, we just kind of think, well, no, my family's nothing to do with me. Is
Yes.
Of course it is. But I think
Mm.
collective, this systemic collective understanding is really important, and it's only quite recently that people have begun to look at what used to be called hysterical illness, things
Mm.
to individuals and sometimes to collectives of people. But now they're now being seen as functional neurological disorders, which is different. So that means there's stuff is going on. Actual symptoms are being experienced. Our behavior is going on, and nobody can understand it. And this is having effect on the whole organism, which is, of course, how Western medicine regards this. But of course, from a collective or shamanic point of view, we can see something completely different. And I suppose that in, for example, Italian culture, Southern Italian culture, that the whole tarantism, where women just have a complete breakdown and a sort of semi-collapse, and then the only way that they can be brought back into society again is for musicians to come and play the tarantella rhythms or the dances of purification, which are extraordinary. And a violinist or some other a percussionist or someone will come to the bedside of that person, play those rhythms, which are very interesting. They're either the tarantella rhythm is a da 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 kind of rhythm, but also that sort of that long 6/8 rhythm, which is dum di da da dum di da da dum, gets you up and gets you moving. And of course, then the women dance and they dance out what is in them, and very often seem to dance like a spider, which was how being called that. But that was those things were happening in a culture which was very restrictive to women, and but everyone nevertheless understood that this would happen, and these were the things you did. There were rituals and containers for that. Help bring healing.
Yes. I love that so much. There was something about your story. Well, there's your story about stories, actually, the way that we can witness a story being told on the screen or a theatre, and it can activate an ancestral story within us. And I was thinking again about how that's also something that we've lost, and I think are sort of starting to reclaim a connection to again in traditional cultures. So much of our understanding of the context is held in the stories, and we share these collective stories, these myths, these folk tales that are passed down that tell us these things. We know these things.
Yeah.
And I was just, as you were saying that, I was like, oh my gosh, I see that all the time in the work that I do with people, where we can suddenly recognize ourselves in a myth, in a story. And that could be, as you say, actually in a film or a book.
Yeah.
But I'd like there's something in that I feel is part of what this kind of missed, our current misunderstanding of context that relates to story. So I'd love to know if there's anything that activates in you.
We've been talking about the traumatic end of this, but actually the other end of that is the story that saves us, the story that puts us back into context, and the retelling of that. And of course,
I love just to say, I love a happy ending, Kathleen. So I'm glad that we've gone here.
All of the questions are based upon the retelling of the story, the representation of the story, either in a ritual context or in a liturgical context. And I suppose most people who are watching would understand that if you go to any kind of high church around Easter week, then you have the chance to do exactly that, because and I'm not going to apologize for using this as an example, because I think it's one everyone would understand, which is that Good Friday is a representation. I mean, the Maundy Thursday is a representation of the Last Supper. Good Friday is a representation of the crucifixion, and everyone undergoes that. It's told liturgically. All the songs are sung. The statues are covered. It's people come to the cross on their knees if they're in a Catholic church, and they kiss the cross, and then the tabernacle where the host is kept is left open on that day. So the tomb is empty. And then on Easter Sunday, you all go for the midnight mass, and it's like, he is risen, vos iste novos Christia, as they say. And so it's an extraordinary experience, and everyone undergoes that story and is part of that story. And it's this sort of massive identification, with that sort of high point of the Christian story. And these are what the ancient mysteries did. We went and suffered with Persephone. We went into the underworld with her. And in the greater mysteries, we came out again. And it was believed that people who had done that would not suffer punishment after death because they had undergone the purifications of Persephone. So these great, great stories. And of course, in a tribal context, there are similar great deeds, great myths, great stories. But a myth is something that is entirely true. And I hate it that our language, made it now. I mean, we talk about, the myth of aspirin or the myth of, something else,
Yes.
as if it were an untruth. Rather,
Yes. When to me it's the opposite.
it's the
Yes, it's the
actual,
deepest
the
truth.
whole thing about myth is what, Celestius, he was the amanuensis of the Emperor Julian, who tried to reintroduce paganism into the Roman Empire. And he wrote a wonderful book called Concerning the Gods. And he said that a myth is something that has never happened and is always happening. Meaning this is a story that is in a form that can be understood and remembered by even the most boneheaded person. It's not going to be forgotten. Working with the British mysteries, of course, you see that all the time. You can stop anyone in this country and say, tell us about King Iceland. They'll know several things. They'll know he had a round table. They'll know Merlin in there at some point, and that there was a grail. And if you say the grail, you mean the Holy Grail. So people may not know the stories and could not tell you them in great detail, but they know an awful lot. So the national myths that we have are also there, and of course they are both our saving, and of course they can be our curse. I don't know if you saw there was a program just before the Balkan War when there was a program which was looking at Radovan Karadzic, and there he was going up to a mountainside with some chums, and they built a fire and they started singing songs. And I knew what I was looking at. I could see what was happening there. And I called John in from the kitchen. I said, you have to look at this. I said, this is really scary, because what these guys are doing, they're reenacting the white eagle of Serbia. They're doing that whole we were injured by Muslims, now let's arm ourselves to do. And it was just like the Nuremberg rally.
Oh my goodness, I got full body chills hearing that. Yeah.
They were going into that atavistic end of the ancestral story to bring it out again, to say we will, all of us, we will conquer. And of course we know what happened after that, which was unspeakable. And when people are fueled by their story in that way, we're seeing very similar things now happening, in different parts of the world. If you're plugged into that ancestral story, which is of vengeance and let's do the other side down as badly as we can, whatever, that's a whole other end of a story and a whole distressing scenario about to carry on. So, yeah, the story can save us, and it can take us into these very dark places too. So we need to always understand where we're responding from. Are we responding as ourselves, or are we responding as a people? I mean, I would defy anyone. I mean, if you go to a football match, you're rooting for one side or the other, even if you don't care a bit about anyone's game, and or know anything about football, but you become involved. And I think, we are humans, so all of those things are possible all at the same time.
Yes. Gosh. As ever, I really love the examples you bring that really help to illuminate and make, there's one thing being able to talk about these things in a way that is, almost like the metaphysics or the first principles of things. But I think these are, I guess the power of story in itself, the way that you bring this alive with examples.
It's not separate from us. We're always,
Mm,
and I've been working with the group over the last 14 or 15 years, which is dedicated to looking at the spirits of institutions,
mm,
because it's such an interesting study, and it's the most difficult one because we're also part of institutions. If we want to
mm,
look at the post office, we are also people who write letters and send and receive mail.
mm,
If we want to talk about the NHS, we are also patients of the NHS, and
mm,
being able to look at things systemically, and whether they're doing their job or whether they're not doing their job, you have to have a bit of perspective. And I suppose that shamanically speaking, when we do exactly the same thing, we're looking at situations which could be national, familial, to do with the workplace, to do with all sorts of things. And we are ourselves also parts of those networks and systems and so on. So having shamanic neutrality to be able to look at it is, I suppose, really the not to be affected by what is going on with someone that you're treating.
mm.
Being able to call upon the spiritual help, that sees the other side of these things. That's an important factor in that, which doesn't mean we don't care. Of course, we have, we want all the goodness that someone can receive from the world, but it's not we who are bringing it. We're wranglers as shamans. We're the wranglers. We're not the healer. Yes, we're the wranglers.
Mm.
We wrangle the healing. We go and get the horses. But we do that according to what the spirits are showing us for the good of somebody.
Mm. So knowing all of what we've just spoken about, unbelievably, we're already coming up on time. um, so of course, amongst people listening to this, there's going to be people who are in some way shamanic practitioners, and there's going to be lots who aren't. But I do feel this conversation is relevant to anyone, everyone,
Yeah,
all of us.
yeah.
So as we start to understand what we're talking about here about the systemic context that all of us are living in, what would you suggest to someone listening? Like, what can they do from here? What is that like? How do we work with that? How do we become aware of that?
I think something very 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 ancient. There was a Stoic philosopher called Hierocles who lived in the 1st century in Alexandria. There are 2 Hierocles, but the one I'm talking about is the Stoic one. And I think of all the people in the ancient world, he was the one that sort of nailed this quite well, because he said his society was one that had come to a point of, oh, we're individuals in a city state, and we can do this, that, and the other, and we have certain responsibilities and so forth. So he was quite a modern person in that respect, and not a very ancient person in prehistory. But he said, we need to consider the circle that we stand in our own circle. Here is ourselves. And then there's another circle outside of us. Here is our family. Here beyond our family are sort of more distant family. And here beyond them are those who are our fellow citizens. And beyond that, there is the world, there is the universe, there is spirit. So he had that sense of how we behave towards each other, and that we include within our everyday understanding, whether it's within our prayer or the way in which we behave, that we stand in relationship to all of these things. And my teacher, one of my teachers, Dan van Kampenhart, used a similar kind of model. He said, if we look to the east, we have our family, the context from which we've come. We have our society, the context in which we live and interact, and which can be quite exclusive. So, you're either a Guardian reader or a Times reader or a Daily Star reader. You don't read all of those papers. You read one of them. So in the same way we associate with different kinds and groups of people, then there's ourselves. We have our own individual sort of soul area. And then there's that much wider universal soul area, which we're also a part of. So whichever of those models you use, whether it's Hierocles or Dan's version of that, if we just spend a little time every day at the end of the day, it's like, how have I been with myself today? Am I pleased with what I've done? Got I really fouled up when I sort of spoke to my boss this morning, whatever it was. But I mean, just sort of looking at those areas of interaction and where you stand with them, and the prayers that you would have with them, or all the realizations that you need to, know there are things to be worked out. But those are areas that we can use, I think, in our daily lives, just in our ordinary spiritual practice, to give ourselves a sense of, I'm not just me, as we're back to John Donne's "No man is an island entire of himself," and neither are we. We are completely interconnected, and really that's what we've been talking about all this time, isn't it? Which is the interconnection of ourselves with the rest of the universe, which is the most fundamental of the animistic principles, that that what we do here affects something over here. Whether we're thinking it, feeling it, saying it, doing it, those things have vibration, movement, and effect. And just like the spider knows exactly, if we go back to the spider and the spider's web, the spider's web is beautifully balanced. It knows when there's something there, when there's a wind, when there's someone near, when there's been a big sound, it moves. So that we can make our own web a little bit more stable if we are aware of what's going on and how we come back to the center of it again.
Yes, there's something, there's a sensitivity in what you just described that feels so tangible. The spider isn't just sort of sitting there and only aware of things when they're kind of right in the spider's face. The spider is like there. It's so intrinsically part, almost like the spider and the web are one. Because the web is an extension. There is something so beautiful in that. Something that okay. Well, firstly, we've had talked about potentially talking about a different topic today, and you just touched on that topic, that kind of like the idea of a daily spiritual practice. We haven't got time to go into that now, but I'm taking it as a sign that perhaps we do need to come back and do an episode on that. Actually, after all,
absolutely, what that might consist of, yeah, indeed. I think it's really,
I think there's something
really important because the instability that's in the world at the moment is such that we need to have some really grounded ways, whether we're believers in anything or not. But, we know that these things impact our world, and that, one thing that happens in one place is now going to affect everything in the whole world.
And that feels, just to go back to what you were saying at the beginning around, people might have this sense that they've been cursed, and usually they haven't, but there perhaps is some truth that there, for example, has been jealous thoughts or envious thoughts aimed at them. And I think that's also something that we are slowly beginning to reclaim the awareness of, that not everything that happens has a visible, rational cause and effect. And the more we understand that, as you say, every part of the spider web has an impact on the rest of the spider web.
We also move the web. It's like we're not people to whom things are done only, but also people who do the doing. So,
yes.
I think that's always a very important consideration. Is like, I just had an example of it this week. Someone put up something on Facebook, which was something she believed to be true. I shared it. It became clear that it was a meme that someone had dreamed up, and she immediately policed it, and so did I. So, but it was like we didn't want to spend more time spreading disinformation. So, but I mean, our responsibility is also is to, like I always apologise when I do walk through a spider's long thread, and I always try and get hold of it and put it back.
It's rehooking. That's exactly what I do.
I just don't see it because the sun's not shining on the
The spider's probably looking, just thinking, well, I like the effort that they've done, but they've done a terrible job. I would not have put it there.
All got areas that we can work on. Yeah.
I think what you've really brought to life here, and particularly the last thing you said, is the recognition that, of course, we are in the center of our web, but then there's all these other webs that kind of overlap and are intrinsically linked to our web. And all of that is interweaving, interplaying, affecting each other all the time.
Yeah. It is, and if suddenly, your daughter gets up and says, I need to go and live in Iceland, for 5 years to, practice, counting moss or whatever it is, it'll have an effect on the family, isn't it? Because that will be someone they are not with anymore, and they'll be somewhere else. So, I mean, everything we decide, moves the web. Absolutely.
Oh, I feel like we've taken such a beautiful tour around the context, and there's been so much in this that I think has just been brought to life so viscerally. I'm so glad that you mentioned the web right at the beginning, because I feel like it's one that was just allowed us to keep coming back to.
And with all my students, I always use this as an example, because I get them to stand up and appreciate how that is. So we actually set up a web so that they can feel that for themselves. I think it is, spiders are great teachers.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that's the episode bringing to a close for the moment. Where can listeners find out more about you and your vast body of wonderful work?
Well, I have a website which is www.hallowquest, HALLOW quest, all one word, hallowquest.org.uk. And my courses are on there, but my shamanic practice is not, because I don't advertise. People usually have to come to me via word of mouth, because I just wouldn't be able to see that number of people. So, but they can see me there. They can see me on Substack, where my name, Caitlín Matthews, dash Hallowquest Sanctuary. They can read me there. All my new writing is there, and I occasionally put up shamanic posts as well as other things. I have a wide interest in many things, and so I write about those things. And there are courses there as well that people can do online. Otherwise, my shamanic work in terms of teaching is only in person. I don't do online courses. I can talk from now to kingdom come, as I've just demonstrated. I really cannot teach on this online. I just want to make that clear. I need to see someone's work. I need to see what comes out of it, and to be there and to have the context of the understanding.
I so appreciate that about you, and also just the sheer breadth and depth of your work. I really do. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful as ever. Thank you so much.
Great. And we'll do it again sometime.
I very much hope you enjoyed watching that. And if you did, and you're not already subscribed, then do hit that bell thingy and subscribe to automatically get each fresh new episode as it's released each week. If you'd like to find out more about the work we do at Be Mythical to guide and support old souls in this new world to live their own unique myth, Do hop along to bemythical.com and you'll find out all the ways you can join us and go deeper with us on your own mythical journey. Lots of love for now. Mwah. See you again next week.